Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to give everyone a minute or two to join us from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. All right, I'll give it another couple of seconds as the waiting room is trickling down, and then we'll get started. Thank you for joining us. All right, it's 10:03, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So we are recording, just so everyone knows at this time. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about MOVA and our Victim and Survivor Grants Program. For those who don't already know me, my name is Ashley Renich-Malik. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Grants Administration Specialist and Procurement Lead at MOVA. I'm just going to go over some logistics and housekeeping quickly before we get started. This is a Zoom webinar, so you cannot be seen or heard as audience members, but you can see us, the presenters, and the presentation. However, we still encourage you to actively participate. We ask that you paste any questions you have into the Q&A function found in the Zoom toolbar. Any questions placed in the chat function may be overlooked. We will answer questions throughout and at the end of the presentation. The session will be recorded and posted to our website for your future reference afterwards. If you joined us today seeking information on accessing individual victim services or support, please email victimservices-mova@mass.gov. We also put that email address into the chat for your reference. There is ASL interpretation and closed captions available during today's session. ASL interpreters will be pinned to the screen. To view closed captions, go to the bottom of your screen, click on the up arrow next to live transcript, and then choose show subtitle. If you are having trouble seeing the interpreters, viewing the captions, or have any other tech issues today, please message all panelists and we will be happy to help out. In accordance with the Executive Office of Technology Services and Securities Enterprise Use and Development of Generative Artificial Intelligence Policy, a mouthful, MOVA does not allow the use of AI-generated recording tools unless approved in advance by MOVA, as they may jeopardize confidentiality and privacy. Anyone using unapproved AI tools will be removed from the webinar. All right, at this time, we'll do introductions and then get into the meat and potatoes. So as I mentioned, my name is Ashley Renich-Malik. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Grant Administration Specialist at MOVA.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kristen Wen, Director of Grants Administration at MOVA, she, her pronouns.
Good morning, everyone. This is Kristen Tavano, BD Director of Grants Administration.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Madeline Gorman, she, her, and I am the Deputy Chief of Staff at MOVA.
Thank you, team. All right, our agenda for today is as follows. So we will first do an introduction to us, MOVA, the Massachusetts Office for Victim Assistance. Then we'll talk about what everyone is excited to hear about, the Victim and Survivor Services VSS grants, and then including the upcoming FY27 VSS funding opportunity. In that, we'll talk about eligibility, allowable and unallowable services, post-award requirements, application logistics, and then frequently asked questions and your questions. I am more than happy both throughout the presentation and afterwards to answer your questions, but I do want to say up front that I cannot answer questions specific to your program, services, etc., and whether or not your organization is eligible or a good fit for this funding. When the application is posted, which we'll talk about later on today, I encourage you to read through the eligibility criteria and the purpose of the funding, and then make a determination from there about whether or not you fit. It is impossible for me to know without reading your entire application whether or not you will be a good fit for a funding or eligible. So MOVA will be evaluating those details only after applications have been received. That's a very popular question, so I want to make sure everyone knows where we're coming from today. So then, now that that has all been said, I'm going to pass it over to Kristen Wen to introduce us to MOVA and the VSS grant that we are opening.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you for the introduction and the logistics and housekeeping for this morning. We're excited to talk a little bit about MOVA, the work that we do, and this upcoming grant opportunity that I'm sure everybody is eager to learn more about. So just starting with a little bit of background about who the Massachusetts Office for Victim Assistance is and the work we do. MOVA is an independent state agency that operates under the guidance of the Victim and Witness Assistance Board. The board provides oversight and strategic direction to MOVA, and it also includes leadership such as the Attorney General, District Attorney members, a public member, and 3 survivor members. MOVA strives to promote high quality, comprehensive, and coordinated services for victims of crime. And we do this through ensuring that services are trauma-informed, culturally responsive, and accessible. We strive to serve as a statewide central resource for victim service providers, and we do this by offering technical assistance, funding, and strategic support to organizations across Massachusetts, and providing opportunities for collaboration among service providers in different regions and different specialties. Covering some of the work that we do some policy and legislative work by advocating for laws and policies that enhance victim rights, access to services, and funding. We offer training and professional development opportunities and education for service providers. Grants administration, of course, which we will be talking through today, managing federal and state funding streams, distributing grants to victim service providers, and managing those grants through the duration of the contract periods. MOVA offers information and referral services, and we have some individuals on our victim service team that connect victims and survivors of crime to the services that they need, such as legal services, counseling, shelters, and services of that nature. We also maintain a statewide database of resources called Ask MOVA that's available on our website, and throughout this presentation, Madeline will share links to our website and other resources that are available. One of the newest updates for the work that MOVA does, we recently are beginning to administer the Victim Compensation Program. In the Victim Compensation Program, the staff that are working in that program administer financial assistance to eligible victims for expenses like medical bills, lost wages, or funeral costs in the aftermath of crime. And lastly, we manage and have oversight over the Garden of Peace, which is a memorial in Boston honoring victims of homicide in Massachusetts. Sorry. Our mission. So I'm going to read our mission that is shown here. MOVA strives to advance victim rights by ensuring all victims and survivors of crime across the Commonwealth are supported and empowered through access to high quality services that are trauma informed, culturally responsive, and reflective of diverse communities. We achieve this through survivor informed work, advocacy for enhanced victim rights and services, partnerships with agencies and individuals, and a commitment to providing funding and services for underserved and marginalized communities. So that is our mission through many aspects of the work that we do that I just highlighted. We strive to meet our mission each year. And one thing that I would note about our mission, vision, values, and the overall work we do, we are unwavering in this mission. I know there's been a lot in the news about the changing kind of priorities from the federal administration and other changes related to grant conditions or how this may impact the work that we do. So we're committed to this mission and work to meet these goals each year. Next slide, please. Jumping ahead into a little bit about the introduction to the grants that we administer. So first I'll touch base on some of the 3 grant programs that we administer that are up for renewal this upcoming grant cycle. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Victim and Survivor Services Grant, which is the largest grant that we administer that will be up for an open bid, which means it's open and competitive for potentially new applicants, continued applicants. But first, just highlighting some of the other grant programs outside of the VSS, Victim and Survivor Services Grant, that we administer. Safe Plan funds are for community-based advocates based in district and probate and family courts. And the purpose of Safe Plan is to support victims and survivors with restraining and protective orders. This funding is placed, it's in place to train domestic and sexual violence advocates directly in court settings. And Safe Plan advocates help victims navigate processes around obtaining protective orders, understanding their rights, and also supporting safety planning. In FY26, we funded 16 organizations to provide Safe Plan services, and FY27 will be a renewal year. And funding through the 16 organizations, we had the goal in mind of having geographic distribution across the state and court coverage across the state. But with this being a renewal, it would, for FY27, which is this upcoming fiscal year, it will not be open for new applicants. Next up, we have the Culturally Specific Victim Services, CSVS for short. The CSVS is a grant program that was created in state fiscal year 2022. And this was created to address inequities in access to victim services for communities of color, specifically in under-resourced regions such as Western Massachusetts. As with Safe Plan in state fiscal year 2027, the CSVS program will be a renewal cycle. So those who are currently receiving funding under this grant program will be eligible to reapply to renew their grant in the upcoming year, and it will not be open to new applicants. And lastly, we have the Civil Legal Aid for Victims of Crime, CLAVIC for short. The purpose of the CLAVIC program is to provide free statewide trauma-informed civil legal services to victims and survivors of crime. In FY26, MOVA funded 9 legal service organizations to provide the direct services. And this was through what we call a pass-through contract. So there's 2 organizations that overall administer the program, and for FY27, the CLAVIC program will be a renewal year. The Victim and Survivor Services, as I mentioned, is the largest grant program that MOVA currently administers. The purpose of the Victim and Survivor Services Grant, VSS for short, is to fund organizations to provide counseling, advocacy, and intervention services free of charge to victims and survivors of crime. In FY26, we funded 92 organizations, and in FY27, this will be the start of an open and competitive grant cycle. A little bit more about the VSS funding opportunity. As a grant-making organization, MOVA is responsible for ensuring competition and fairness in grant distribution. And the reason we're opening this up for an open bid, it's been the last time that we had an open and competitive grant application for the VSS funding was in FY19. So that started in 2018, so roughly 8 or 9 years since we have last completed and went through an open and competitive cycle to open up this funding opportunity for potentially new projects, new organizations, or those who may not have been able to apply for MOVA funding in the past. So we're excited to be able to offer this opportunity and to see what kind of innovation may be happening and reviewing applications for continued projects, potentially new projects. We anticipate having $30 million available for FY27 grants, and this is across all of the grant programs that we administer. For the VSS contract, the initial duration will be a 1-year grant with an opportunity to apply for renewal in FY28. Funding will be year by year, meaning that any unspent funding in the first year of the grant, FY27, will not carry forward into the second year of the grant, which is potential, depending on renewal status, would be FY28. And historically, we've utilized different funding streams to administer this program, a mix of state funding and federal funding, which is the Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, which I will talk about a little bit in more detail. For this grant cycle, we only have VOCA dollars available for FY27. So that will be used to, this federal funding source will be used to support the FY27 grants, and FY28 is funding sources still determining what those will look like. The FY27 to FY28 VSS funding, the intention is to support free services to victims and survivors of various crimes in different geographies and in populations throughout the state. In order for victims and survivors to be eligible for services supported by this grant, they do not need to report the crime to law enforcement. And later, Kristen Tabano will be covering more about eligibility and some of the funding objectives you can expect to see when this grant opportunity is posted. So what is the Victims of Crime Act, VOCA for short? So I will provide a brief snapshot of the history of VOCA, and with this being the primary funding source that will be supporting the upcoming grants in FY27. So the primary source of funding that we've received over many years, and the reason that MOVA was created was to administer the federal VOCA funds. The VOCA Victims of Crime Act was passed by Congress in 1984, therefore establishing the Crime Victims Fund, CVF. Crime types that are supported by this grant include domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and other underserved crimes, such as homicide bereavement services. And millions of dollars are deposited annually into this fund from criminal fines and penalties collected by the federal government. This fund helps support an average of 3.7 billion crime victims across the country every year. And the funds that come from the Crime Victims Fund or that are deposited into the Crime Victims Fund do not come from taxpayer dollars. They come from people or corporations that are convicted of federal crimes. And MOVA is a designated state office to administer the award and to administer and award VOCA funds in Massachusetts to local programs and government agencies. Next slide, please. Is my organization eligible for funding? So I will pass it to Kristen Tavano, and I will spotlight her to make sure that everyone can see her as she's presenting. And Kristen will talk a little bit more about eligibility and some of the funding objectives you can expect to see.
Kristen. So again, I'm Kristen Tavano. I'm the Deputy Director of Grants Administration at MOVA. And in the next few slides, I'm going to give an overview of eligibility requirements to apply for the upcoming Victim and Survivor Services, or VSS, funding opportunity. So generally speaking, organizations are eligible to apply for VSS funding if they operate in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, if they are a public or nonprofit organization. This includes Native American tribal governments, federally recognized or other. If they have a minimum of a one-year history of providing services to victims and survivors of crime at the time of application. If they have the organizational and administrative capacity to provide proposed services and meet grant requirements. What this means is that your organization has financial support from other sources. Your organization is able to maintain a minimum of 3 months of operating costs. Your organization is able to provide documentation which acknowledges the support of your organization's leadership in applying for funding. And that will be a component of your application. Should you choose to apply, we will ask for a letter of support from your agency's leadership. And finally, eligible organizations must use MOVA funding to provide direct services. And I will talk more about how we define direct services in an upcoming slide. Next slide, please. So on the flip side of the coin, organizations are not eligible for VSS funding if they have less than a one-year history of providing services to victims and survivors of crime at the time of the application. They're not eligible if they are eligible for a fiscal year 27 culturally specific victim services in Western Mass, or CSVS as we call it, renewal grant. So as Kristen mentioned previously, if you are a currently funded CSVS program, there are 5 of them, we're going to be running a separate fiscal year 27 renewal grant for you. Individuals are not eligible to apply for funding under this grant, and that includes both individuals providing direct services and or individual victims or survivors of crime seeking funding in general. Organizations are not eligible if they do not have the administrative or organizational capacity to support the proposed services and meet the grant requirements. And I talked a little bit more about those pieces in the prior slide, or if they would not use MOVA funding to provide direct services. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what services may be funded through this grant. Next slide, thank you. As I mentioned, as an eligibility requirement, allowable direct services are defined by VOCA as those that respond to the emotional, psychological, and physical needs of crime victims, assist crime survivors to stabilize their lives after a victimization, assist crime survivors to understand and participate in the criminal justice system, and restore a measure of safety and security to crime survivors. Thank you. Next slide. So allowable direct services will fit into one or more of the following categories, and the examples that I'll provide under each of these categories are non-inclusive. If you have questions about the specific services you would provide under our grant, if funded through our grant, please reach out to us directly. These are some examples of allowable direct services to support a victim or survivor in assessing, responding to, and navigating the impacts of crime via information and referral services. So some examples of this are case management, providing information on and assistance with applying to victim compensation, making referrals to places and things such as local law enforcement, food pantries, or other services provided by your organization or another organization. The next category is advocacy and accompaniment. Examples of this category include court advocacy, both civil and criminal, or medical advocacy, such as supporting victims at hospitals during forensic examinations. The next category is emotional support and safety services, and some examples of this include crisis intervention services, safety planning, counseling related to the victimization, both group and individual, hotline response and support, trauma-informed yoga, art therapy, and peer support activities. Next category is shelter and housing services, and examples include relocation assistance, transitional housing, and emergency shelter. And finally, criminal and civil justice system assistance. Examples under this category include trial and/or parole notification, case disposition information, and victim impact statement assistance. Is a non-inclusive list of some of the crime and victimization types that can be supported with our grant funding. And again, including but not limited to domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, child sexual abuse, child physical abuse or neglect, survivors of homicide victims, and human trafficking. So moving on to what the grant cannot support. Some examples of unallowable services are participating in lobbying, political, or fundraising activities on MOVA grant time. Providing perpetrator rehabilitation is also unallowable. However, this does not prevent those who have been identified as an offender from being eligible to receive services related to a victimization that they have experienced. Activities to improve the criminal legal system are unallowable. Examples of this are costs to support expert testimony for the prosecution, or providing travel, lodging, or meal expenses for victims subpoenaed to testify in a criminal case. I just wanted to note there that it is allowable to pay for lodging, meals, and travel for victims and their families so that they can attend court or court proceedings, but not for them to testify in the criminal case. Activities exclusively related to crime prevention are unallowable. Out-of-pocket victim expenses, including lost wages, medical bills, and deductibles, are unallowable. As a general rule, cash cannot be given directly to victims. And finally, most medical costs, including doctor and hospital bills, home health care, and medical equipment, are unallowable. Again, just like with the allowable cost list, this list does not include all unallowable costs, and we definitely encourage you to read our policies and procedures manual and reference the unallowable and allowable cost lists, which we will be sharing in the chat shortly. Next slide. Thank you. So we're going to be moving on to some examples of specific costs which could be included in your application's budget request. MOVA budgets have the following cost categories as they appear on this slide. In order to perform the aforementioned allowable services, these are the cost categories that you will place all of your itemized requests, or line items as we call them, under your application. In the chat, we'll be including a non-exhaustive list of unallowable and allowable items that can be included in your budget request. Madeline will be dropping that in the chat shortly. Again, if you intending on applying for the grant and there are services or costs that you don't see listed within our policies and procedures manual or on the list I was just talking about, please reach out to us and we can discuss the allowability. And I think that is my final slide. Yes, I'm going to pass it over to Ashley.
All right, so I'm going to talk about what you should know if you receive a grant from MOVA. First, we're going to talk about the Grants Policies and Procedures Manual, the P&P, which Madeline will be putting into the chat the link to our current P&P so you can reference that. This is our go-to guide for grant-related policies, requirements, and resources. Before applying for the FY27 VSS funding opportunity, we highly encourage you to review the most up-to-date version of the P&P. This, as I mentioned, outlines all the things you would need to know as a grant recipient. I did want to share some of the work that we've done with the P&P over the past year. MOVA worked with Language Line to update our policies and procedures manual to pare down the number of pages and to update the reading level from a grade 16 to a grade 9 reading level. So this is just another example of how MOVA is prioritizing accessibility to our grants and funding and to ensure that all types of victims and survivors in the Commonwealth are able to be served. While all the juicy details can be found in our policies and procedures manual, including the things that are outlined here, in the next few slides, I'll call attention to some of the high-level requirements that you'll need to know if you are awarded a VSS grant from MOVA. So that starts with some financial considerations. One of the most important things to know about VSS grants is that they operate on a cost reimbursement basis, which means that you will need to spend the money first, submit an invoice, which we call an expense report, and backup documentation to us on a monthly basis. And then you'll receive that funding after the fact, no more than 45 days after an error-free expense report is received. As outlined in our eligibility criteria, it is required that you have a minimum of at least 3 months of program expenses on hand in order to support this type of process. We, of course, encourage more than a minimum of 3 months. That's just the minimum. It is also required that you have some sort of financial management system in place in order to track grant funding in a way that is separate from your other funding or revenue. Next, it is also required that you collect data about the services you are providing and the people you are serving and report it to us quarterly. We do recommend that you have a system or technology in place to support this type of reporting. More information about data collection and reporting can be found in the MOVA Data and Performance Reporting Guide, which I know Madeline just popped into the chat, so you can refer to that for more information. Next is monitoring. MOVA will conduct a risk assessment for all grantees and assign a risk level to their contract at the beginning of the contract. We will also conduct desk reviews and site visits throughout the grant period to review compliance with all grant requirements. So what's next? You liked everything that you heard. Now you're interested in applying. So this is our anticipated timeline, subject to change, but this is what we're working with right now. We anticipate on posting the grant application on October 14th, 2025. This will also include what has formerly been known as the request for grant applications, RGA. It's now called the call for grant applications, CGA. That will be available at that time as well. We have 2 grant application workshops and a technical assistance session to support the application process. The first one will occur on October 21st. This will be virtual. The second one will be in person, same information as the virtual one, just in person, and on October 28th. I know Madeline just put the registration links into the chat for those two. So you can check out the information in there, the times, the locations, and everything, and then register if that's something you're interested in. Finally, we will have an eGrants technical assistance session. We'll talk about eGrants in a second. On November 19th, we'll publish the registration link when that's available, but that will also be coming down the pipeline as well to help support the application process. Applications will be due on eGrants on December 2nd at 12 p.m. EST. And then we anticipate on having the board vote on the awards in April 2026. After that vote, we'll notify all applicants and begin contracting for successful applicants. And as was mentioned earlier, the grant period for FY27 will begin on July 1st of next year and end on June 30th of the following year. So as I just mentioned before, these are the grant application workshops. The first one is going to be virtual on October 21st from 10 to 12, very similar to what we're doing here. I know those links are in the chat. And then the in-person one will be on October 28th from 1 to 3 at the Best Western Royale Plaza Hotel in Marlborough. So feel free to check those out and register if you're interested. The next thing I wanted to share with you all, which I had alluded to, is eGrants. So eGrants is MOVA's grants database where all grant management will occur from application to monitoring. If your organization is going to apply for a FY27 VSS grant, you can, between now and the application release date, you can also do this afterwards, but if you're feeling excited, you can register your organization on eGrants. You can create users for anyone who needs to be involved with the grant and also complete the mandatory contact information section. I know Madeline put into the chat the step-by-step guide for these three different steps, so you can find all the details and screenshots about how to do that there. Finally, I wanted to share that we are seeking peer reviewers for this grant review. To participate in a peer review for this grant, you must be available during the first half-ish of December 2025 to review applications. I know that we will be putting into the chat, if it's available, the peer reviewer questionnaire, which will be due no later than October 30th, and we will notify those who have submitted the questionnaire mid-November if you have been selected. Some things to note, some commonly asked questions is that you can apply and also be part of an applying organization and be part of the peer review. We do have a question in there that asks about what organization you're a part of or any conflicts of interest you might have. We can work with those, most likely. And then secondly, review must occur during non-MOVA funded time if you are part of an organization or if you are partly funded by MOVA. All right, so we're going to hop into our frequently asked questions section, and then we will open the floor for your questions. First question is there a budget amount that you recommend we apply for? So we recommend that you apply for essential costs necessary to provide direct victim services. The average FY26 VSS grant award, so this current year, was $390,000. Any limitations that are put on either dollar amounts or types of items to be included in the budget will be in that call for grant applications document that I mentioned, which will be published on October 14th. Next, what, if any, impacts might the current administration have on this funding or procurement? Another great question. MOVA will receive our first federal award administered under the current federal administration this fall. And then at that time, we will provide more information as it becomes available. Can we apply for more than one VSS application? No, we are asking all organizations to include all proposed programming under one application. Next, what will be different for currently funded organizations versus new organizations? So most everything will be the same, whether it is your first time applying for a VSS award or whether you have either applied for and not received or applied for and have received VSS funding in the past. The only additional consideration that we will be making for current/returning applicants is history of grant funding reversion. All right, so at this time, I'm going to open the floor to your Q&A. I know there have been some in the Q&A function throughout the presentation, and I know they've been answered, but I will see if my team wants to answer any of these verbally. At this time, you can also begin putting your questions into the Q&A function if you have not done so already. Anything that's in the chat may be overlooked, as I mentioned before.
So far, it looks like Madeline has answered all of the questions that we've received in Q&A. So as Ashley said, if you have anything on your mind, feel free to drop them in now. I do see one in the chat. How competitive is this grant program? How many applications do you get versus how many are you able to fund? That's challenging to answer. So I'll share my thoughts on how competitive it will be, and if any MOVA staff would like to piggyback on any thoughts. I would say it will be a highly competitive grant application. The past few renewal cycles, we have had $42 million in grant funding to put out across all of our grant programs. This year we have 30 million. So not only is it a decline in funding, we are anticipating that all of the currently funded organizations will reapply for funding, plus a mix of new projects, potentially new organizations that are looking to apply. So I do anticipate that it will be a highly competitive grant application, just given the funding that is available. And this year we're funding 92 organizations. I think we're estimating anywhere between like 110 to 150 potential applications to come in. But without having had put the intent to apply out yet, without having released the grant application yet, and just doing these preliminary information sessions, it's hard to say exactly how many may apply, but I don't know if anyone else at MOVA has anything to add to that. Can you share a little bit about similar grant requests from multiple providers in the same region of the state? Would anybody like to tackle
Kristen, I was reading through that one too, and I think this is similar. Let me know if it's not, about how will you determine grant awards from similar agencies in the same area. So for both of those, there's a multitude of different factors that will be considered, from the type of services, what type of populations you're serving, a multitude of different things that could be considered in terms of determining grant awards. That information, our evaluation criteria, will be available in the call for grant applications, that document that is sort of like your go-to for the application, when we post the application on October 14th. So I encourage you to read through that and see the different types of criteria that we will be considering for awards at that time.
We had another one in the chat, or the Q&A. Can organizations already receiving CLAVIC funding, which is the civil legal assistance funding program that Kristen talked about early on in the presentation, so can organizations already receiving CLAVIC funding apply for VSS funding in addition to the CLAVIC funding? And the answer to that is yes. If your organization is eligible, you may apply for VSS funding in addition to the funding that you already received from CLAVIC.
I see Madeline is typing an answer to this question, but I'll address it verbally as well, because it's an easy question to answer. Is match funding required for the VSS grant opportunity? So there will be instructions about match in the call for grant applications. However, we have, over the past several years, have implemented a policy where we, MOVA, can issue blanket match waivers across all funding. So our intention is to, for this grant application, have a blanket match waiver available. So you can you automatically opt into this match waiver, but applicants do have the choice to opt out of the match waiver if they would like to report match and if there is match. But I will say is that as part of the scoring and evaluation process, applicants who opt into the match waiver versus those who opt out of the match waiver will all be evaluated on the same criteria. So whether or not you can provide match, whether or not you can't provide match will not be a scoring factor. Do you recommend, oh, sorry, were you going to
do the same thing? Yeah, go for it, Kristen.
Thank you. Do you recommend we coordinate with other agencies in our region so we do not overlap with each other? We can't really make any recommendations as this is a competitive grant process. However, it's not required to coordinate. One of the funding objectives is to look at partnerships and think about innovation and collaboration. So if that is something you would want to include in your grant application, that is something we will look at, but it's not necessarily something that is required. It's not like going into this grant in this upcoming fiscal year, we're only going to fund one domestic violence service in that region. Like there's definitely a diverse kind of group of providers that will be funded and may continue. So hopefully that answers the question, but we're not quite in the place to make like specific recommendations on what should or shouldn't be included in the grant application.
Thank you, team. So at this time, it looks like we've answered all questions that are put into the Q&A function. I encourage you to continue sending those if you have them. Of course, we'll stay on for a few more minutes just to see if there's anything lingering, but I will hop on over to our last slide, which has all of our information. Give you a second to look at that, and then I'll stop sharing my screen so we can actually look at each other and continue working on your questions if you have them.
I know this was said at the beginning, but also we will share the slides for this PowerPoint and a recording of the PowerPoint and a list of the questions and answers from both this information session and the previous one. And we will also share a list of the links and attachments that were put into the chat so that people have access to all of those. And that will happen within the week.
It's like participants are starting to trickle out. And we do not currently have any open questions and answers. So as, or open questions, excuse me. If there is anything else. Yes, so we just received a question. Will a list of the critical upcoming dates be included? Absolutely. The dates will be included in any communication moving forward.
Yeah, so we'll give it another minute or so just to see if there's anything lingering, but otherwise, if not, thank you for joining us for learning about this upcoming FY27 VSS Open Grant Opportunity, and you'll see all of the things posted, like Madeline said, within the week, including dates, including links, including documents. So thank you for joining us today. There is a question in the Q&A. So given the quote unquote average amount of award expected, does that indicate that any previous grantees with larger amounts should not request level funding?
It doesn't necessarily indicate that. As we've mentioned previously in this presentation, we encourage applicants to request reasonable and necessary costs to operate their program. So whether that is level, if you're a currently funded organization, if that means level funding, if that means more funding than you're currently receiving, it is a competitive and open opportunity. So it could go either way, but we encourage you to ask for what is reasonable and necessary. But for all renewal grants, for this grant, for this open competitive grant, level funding is not guaranteed. So there will be an evaluation process that we will go through, and ultimately there is limited funding that we will be working with. So looking to ensure that reasonable necessary costs are and essential services are continued.
Thank you, Kristen. All right, we'll give it another like 30 seconds and see if anything else comes in. If you think of anything after those 30 seconds, you can feel free to email us and we'll continue answering questions that way.